Imagine a day that begins with the promise of peace, a sunny afternoon at a city park, where laughter and gentle chatter fill the air. Now picture that same day spiraling into a confrontation with authority, only for fate to deliver a stunning twist of justice. In a story that challenges injustice at every turn, one woman transforms her own humiliation into a powerful statement of accountability. Stay tuned as we dive deep into a journey that questions the very nature of power and redemption. What happens when someone who has been wronged becomes the arbiter of those who once wronged her? Aisha Thompson's day of unexpected reckoning. It was a bright, warm afternoon in the bustling city of Clearview, Colorado. The park was alive with activity. Children's laughter resonated near the playground, joggers kept a steady pace along the winding trails, and families enjoyed the generous shade provided by the towering oak trees scattered throughout the grounds. In the midst of this serene scene, Aisha Thompson, a respected attorney known for her unwavering commitment to justice, sat quietly on a weathered park bench beside a sparkling pond. With a thick hardcover book resting gently on her lap, Aisha had sought solace in literature to escape the pressures of her demanding career, her focus absorbed in the pages before her. As Aisha immersed herself in her reading, the familiar sound of laughter and conversation was suddenly interrupted by the piercing screech of tires. A police cruiser pulled up sharply to the curb, immediately capturing the attention of nearby park-goers. Two officers emerged from the vehicle, their faces set in stern expressions and their uniforms immaculate, each step exuding authority. Their eyes locked onto Aisha, who, until that moment, had been the sole individual quietly enjoying her afternoon. "Ma'am, may we speak with you for a moment?" One of the officers called out in a tone laced more with suspicion than genuine concern. Aisha lifted her gaze from her book, her calm demeanor unwavering even as uncertainty crept into the air. Without missing a beat, she responded courteously, though her curiosity was piqued by the sudden intrusion. Setting her book carefully aside, Aisha listened as the second officer stepped closer, his clipped tone betraying an underlying impatience. "We received a call about some suspicious activity in the area. Mind telling us what you're doing here?" he inquired. With a hint of bemusement in her eyes, Aisha raised an eyebrow. "Suspicious activity?" she echoed softly. "I'm simply sitting here and reading." In an effort to substantiate her peaceful activity, Aisha held up her book as if to underline her innocence. Yet, the officer's skeptical expressions did not soften. "Can we see some ID?" the first officer demanded abruptly. A flicker of apprehension passed over Aisha's face, her pulse quickened momentarily, but she maintained her composure. "I don't understand why I'm being stopped. I'm just enjoying a day at the park," she explained evenly. The second officer's tone, however, left little room for further dialogue. "Routine," he said, though his tone implied that there was far more at play than a simple check. As a small crowd began to gather around, whispers and uneasy glances spread among onlookers, their eyes darting between Aisha and the uniformed figures. The tension in the air was palpable, as if the very atmosphere recognized an imbalance of power. Aisha sighed softly before reaching into her bag to retrieve her wallet. With a practiced air of calm, she handed over her driver's license. The officer scrutinized the document with an intensity that bordered on mockery. "Aisha Thompson," he read aloud, his voice dripping with condescension. "And what business do you have here, Miss Thompson?" Taking a measured breath, Aisha responded, "I live here in Clearview. I came to enjoy the park, just like anyone else." Yet, instead of allowing her to depart, the officers lingered, their questions growing more intrusive and personal. "Do you always carry a book like that?" one sneered, as if implying that her choice of reading material was somehow incriminating. "Are you alone, or are you waiting for someone?" the other demanded, his hand casually resting on his belt, a gesture that seemed both deliberate and threatening. In that moment, Aisha recognized a dangerous power dynamic. Although she had spent years defending clients in high-pressure courtrooms and handling tense situations with measured grace, this encounter felt different. It was raw, unprovoked, and steeped in prejudice. Yet, she chose her words carefully. "I'm not answering any more questions unless you explain what I'm being accused of," she stated firmly, her tone both respectful and resolute. This declaration appeared to trigger an abrupt change in the officer's demeanor. The first officer, his voice now raised in irritation, snapped, "Don't get smart with us. We're just doing our job, and I know the law." Aisha's eyes narrowed slightly as she replied calmly, "I'm not breaking any laws by sitting in a public park." But reason and fairness were lost on them. The second officer reached out abruptly and grabbed her arm, asserting, "You're resisting," even though Aisha had made no move to evade or resist. Startled and shocked, Aisha exclaimed, "What are you doing?" The murmurs from the surrounding crowd swelled into a cacophony of disbelief and concern. One man quickly produced his phone, determined to capture every moment of what he sensed was an unfolding injustice. "Stop resisting," the officer repeated, louder this time, as though performing for an audience whose collective eyes now bore witness to the incident. In a heartbeat, cold metal clamped around Aisha's wrists as handcuffs clicked into place. Despite the humiliation and the surge of frustration burning in her chest, she fought to remain composed. The officers, ignoring the outcry from onlookers, led her forcibly toward their cruiser. Aisha's eyes sought comfort in the crowd, a silent plea for someone to understand the gravity of what was happening. In that brief, charged moment, her gaze locked with that of a young woman holding a phone aloft, determined to document the injustice. Inside the cramped confines of the police cruiser's back seat, Aisha's mind raced. For years, she had fought for justice as an attorney, defending the rights of her clients and challenging systemic inequities from within the courtroom. Now, she found herself on the other side, an unwilling participant in a system that had suddenly turned against her. The absurdity of the situation was almost too much to bear, yet beneath the layers of shock and humiliation lay a burning anger, a determination that would not be easily quelled. The ride to the station was heavy with silence, punctuated only by the crackle of the police radio, as Aisha stared out the window and watched the world pass by in blurred indifference. At the station, the ordeal was far from over. The booking process was invasive, dehumanizing, and designed to strip away every remnant of dignity. Aisha was fingerprinted, photographed, and then led to a small, fluorescently lit holding cell. The harsh buzz of the overhead lights seemed to echo the cold efficiency of the process, and as one of the officers sneered, "Enjoy your stay," he shut the cell door behind her, leaving her alone with the echo of injustice. Sitting on the cold bench within that cramped cell, Aisha clasped her hands tightly in her lap, replaying the events in her mind over and over. How could a peaceful afternoon in the park transform into such a demeaning and unjust ordeal? The answer was as clear as it was bitter: prejudice. Hours passed in silence until a young officer finally approached with a clipboard in hand. "Miss Thompson, you've been charged with resisting arrest and obstructing a peace officer," he stated flatly. When Aisha pressed for an explanation, his curt reply was, "That's for you to discuss in court." With that, he turned and left, leaving Aisha with the stark reality of the situation. Yet even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, Aisha's inner resolve began to stir. She exhaled slowly, centering herself as she started to think strategically. The charges, she knew, were flimsy and baseless tools intended to intimidate rather than to serve justice. But the fight ahead promised to be arduous. Cases like hers were never simple, and the battle for justice was always fraught with obstacles. Despite everything, Aisha resolved that she would not let this injustice go unchallenged. After what felt like an eternity, Aisha was released on bail. Stepping out into the cool night air, the contrast between the oppressive atmosphere of the station and the liberating chill outside was overwhelming. As she walked down the steps of the building, her eyes caught sight of her friend and colleague, Olivia Davis, waiting by the curb. Olivia's face bore the marks of relief and concern, a silent acknowledgement of the ordeal that had just unfolded. "Are you okay?" Olivia asked, rushing to meet her. Aisha nodded, though a subtle tremor betrayed the turmoil inside. "I'm fine," she replied, even as the word felt hollow. The two of them drove away in silence for a few moments, the weight of what had happened hanging heavily in the car. Olivia kept glancing at Aisha, silently urging her to speak, and finally, the silence was broken. "I'm not going to let this slide," Aisha said with a firm determination that belied the exhaustion in her eyes. "Not this time." Olivia's grip tightened on the steering wheel, both in empathy and in anticipation of the fierce battle that lay ahead. Aisha had every intention of using her knowledge, resources, and the tools of her trade to challenge the injustice that had been inflicted upon her that day. Later that night, back in the modest comfort of her own home, Aisha sat at her kitchen table surrounded by legal pads, open reference books, and a laptop displaying case files. The soft glow of the desk lamp illuminated her determined face as she began meticulously outlining a civil rights lawsuit against the officers and the department responsible for the day's events. Her hands trembled not with fear, but with the simmering intensity of resolve, a promise that she would not allow injustice to go unanswered. As the days turned into weeks, word of Aisha's ordeal began to spread throughout Clearview. The video captured by the determined young witness had gone viral, sparking a nationwide conversation about police misconduct and systemic bias. People from all walks of life reached out with messages of support, sharing their own stories of injustice and their hope for change. With every supportive email, every phone call, and every comment on social media, Aisha's resolve grew stronger. It was clear that her fight was not just for her own dignity, but for every individual who had ever been silenced or dismissed in the face of authority. Even as the public outcry mounted and community rallies formed in support of her case, Aisha continued her diligent preparation for the courtroom battle that lay ahead. Her law firm, initially cautious about the potential repercussions of her high-profile case, began to see that this was more than a personal vendetta, it was a movement. In a calm yet resolute tone, Aisha explained to her colleagues that this fight was about setting a precedent. "This isn't just about me," she said. "It's about ensuring that the rights of every citizen are respected and that those who abuse their power are held accountable." And with that, she began assembling a legal team composed of trusted colleagues who shared her passion for justice. In parallel with her legal preparations, Aisha also reached out to the community. She attended town hall meetings, listened intently to the experiences of those who had suffered at the hands of overzealous law enforcement, and even spoke at local colleges about the urgent need for police accountability and reform. It wasn't long before her efforts resonated far beyond the confines of the courtroom. The viral footage of her arrest capturing her calm defiance even as she was forcibly led away became a symbol of resilience. It ignited a spark in the hearts of many who had felt powerless in the face of systemic oppression. Amidst the flurry of activity, Aisha continued to work tirelessly on her case, her nights spent poring over legal precedents, gathering evidence, and drafting arguments that would dismantle the flimsy claims laid against her. Yet even as she prepared for what would undoubtedly be a grueling battle in court, there was a twist of fate waiting to upend everything she thought she knew about justice. In a turn of events that was as ironic as it was surreal, Aisha received word that the very officers she was challenging had taken an unexpected legal maneuver. Not only had they filed a motion to dismiss her case, a standard delay tactic, but, in a twist that left her reeling, Aisha was informed that she had been assigned to preside as judge in one of their internal misconduct hearings. The revelation hit her like a thunderbolt. For weeks, she had been preparing to fight these officers in court, and now destiny had placed her on the bench, tasked with overseeing the very case in which they were defendants. Sitting at her desk, Aisha stared at the official notice. It was difficult to reconcile the irony. Here she was, having been wronged by those who were supposed to protect the public, and now she was called upon to administer justice to the very same individuals. Doubt and apprehension warred within her. Could she, having experienced such personal injustice, remain truly impartial? Was it possible for her to set aside the anger and frustration that simmered beneath the surface and uphold the principles of fairness? In that moment, Aisha took a deep, steadying breath and reminded herself of the countless lives that depended on a just legal system, lives that could be changed by a fair and transparent process. This was not an opportunity for personal vindication, but rather a chance to demonstrate what real justice looked like. The day of the internal misconduct hearing arrived. The courtroom was modest but filled with an air of anticipation as citizens, media representatives, and community leaders gathered to witness what many hoped would be a turning point in the fight against systemic abuse. The two officers now identified as Officer Jackson and Officer Turner sat at the defendant's table, their uniforms crisp and their expressions guarded. They exchanged furtive glances, their earlier confidence replaced by a palpable sense of dread. For them, this was merely another routine proceeding, a hurdle to be cleared with minimal fuss. Then, the door to the judge's chambers opened, and Aisha Thompson stepped forward. Dressed in a dignified black robe that flowed gracefully as she moved, she took her seat on the bench with an air of calm authority. In that moment, as her eyes swept over the courtroom, the atmosphere shifted. Officer Jackson's face paled, his eyes widening in shock, while Officer Turner's jaw tightened as he struggled to comprehend the situation. The irony was not lost on anyone present. It was Aisha, the very woman they had once humiliated and unjustly detained, who now presided over their fate. Aisha allowed a brief pause to let the gravity of the moment settle over everyone in the room before speaking in a clear, steady voice. "This court is now in session. Please be seated." The officers sat rigidly, their earlier bravado evaporated, as the proceedings commenced. Throughout the hearing, Aisha maintained the utmost professionalism. While listening intently to the arguments presented, she took detailed notes and ensured that every detail was recorded with impartiality. Yet, every now and then, her eyes would flicker in the direction of the officers, noting the way their posture changed, how a fidget of the hand or a hesitant glance betrayed their mounting anxiety. During the opening statements, the defense attorney attempted to argue that the incident which led to Aisha's arrest had been a series of misunderstandings and that the officers had acted in what they claimed was the interest of public safety. However, as the prosecutor laid out the evidence, including witness testimonies and the damning viral footage, the case against them grew increasingly compelling. Aisha's mind, though focused on the legal aspects, couldn't help but recall her own experience from that fateful day at the park. The dismissive tone of the officers, the cold clamping of the handcuffs, and the way the crowd's murmurs had swelled into a roar of injustice were etched vividly in her memory. When the hearing moved to witness testimonies, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew even more charged. A young man named Lucas took the stand, his voice trembling as he recounted the night he had been subjected to excessive force during a routine traffic stop. His testimony was a stark reminder of how quickly power could be misused. "They didn't even give me a chance to speak," Lucas said, his eyes darting between the attorneys and the officers. "It was as if they'd already decided my fate before I could utter a word." His words resonated with the crowd, and Aisha felt a deep sense of responsibility to ensure that every claim was heard and that the truth was allowed to prevail. As the defense attempted to undermine Lucas's account, questioning his recollection of events and trying to cast doubt on his credibility, Aisha maintained a steady, focused gaze. Every detail was noted, every statement weighed carefully against the overwhelming evidence of systemic abuse. The tension in the room was nearly tangible as the testimonies of the victims along with the subtle shifts in the officer's demeanor began to paint a picture of a system that had long been marred by abuse of power. When it was finally the turn of Officer Jackson to testify, he did so with a trembling voice. The prosecutor's questions were relentless, pushing him to explain the sequence of events that led to the use of excessive force. "Officer Jackson," the prosecutor began, "you are accused of using unnecessary force during a routine arrest. Can you explain your actions on that day?" Officer Jackson hesitated, his eyes shifting nervously towards Officer Turner before he stammered, I thought the situation was escalating. I made a judgment call." His voice faltered further when pressed on whether his actions could have been handled differently, and his silence spoke volumes, an unspoken admission of error and regret. Officer Turner's testimony followed a similar pattern. His attempts to justify the excessive force only served to highlight the discrepancies in his account, and as the prosecutor methodically dismantled the defense's arguments, it became increasingly clear that the evidence was overwhelmingly against the officers. Aisha listened intently, her expression carefully neutral, yet inside she was fueled by the memory of her own mistreatment and a deep-seated desire for accountability. After hours of testimony, the hearing drew to a close. Aisha adjourned the session with a measured yet resolute tone. "This court will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m. for further proceedings," she announced. As the courtroom slowly emptied, the two officers lingered near the exit. Their faces were now etched with fear and regret, a stark contrast to the earlier arrogance that had characterized their approach. For a moment, they appeared to contemplate the magnitude of their actions, their eyes searching for any sign of leniency or understanding. But, true to the spirit of justice, Aisha had already set the stage for what would be a long and arduous process of accountability and reform. The next morning, the news of the unprecedented twist had drawn an even larger crowd to the courthouse. Reporters lined the back walls, their pens and cameras ready to capture every nuance of the proceedings. Although Aisha's role as a judge meant that she could not show any personal bias or favoritism, her calm, authoritative presence was enough to unsettle the once complacent officers. As she entered the courtroom once again, her robe flowing with every measured step, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation and the quiet murmur of a community united in its demand for justice. Throughout the day, the attorneys continued their arguments. The prosecutor laid out a powerful closing statement, arguing that the officers' actions were not just a lapse in judgment, but a flagrant abuse of power that must be addressed decisively to restore public trust. In response, the defense tried to downplay the severity of the incident, citing mitigating circumstances and insisting that the officers had merely acted within the bounds of their duties. But as the evidence was reviewed and the testimonies revisited, it became clear that the case was about more than just one incident. It was a mirror reflecting a broader, systemic problem that needed urgent reform. In her final remarks for the day, Aisha summarized the key points with clarity and authority. The role of law enforcement is to protect and serve, with integrity, respect, and fairness. When those entrusted with this responsibility abuse their power, the consequences ripple far beyond the immediate victims, she stated, her voice echoing in the hushed courtroom. It is not enough to simply apologize, meaningful change must come through accountability and reform. She then detailed the consequences that were to be imposed on the officers: a mandatory suspension without pay, compulsory participation in extensive retraining programs, and a permanent disciplinary record that would follow them. The ruling was firm but balanced, ensuring that while accountability was enforced, there was also an opportunity for corrective measures. As the session concluded, Aisha delivered the final ruling with a decisive gavel strike. The courtroom slowly emptied, leaving behind an atmosphere heavy with introspection and the lingering realization that while this case might mark a step forward, the fight for justice was far from over. The officers, now silent and dejected, made no attempt to approach Aisha. Their departure was marked by the slow, measured steps of those who had finally come to understand the gravity of their actions. In the quiet moments after the hearing, as Aisha organized her notes and prepared for the next phase of the case, she reflected on the day's proceedings with a mix of satisfaction and somber resolve. That evening, after the courtroom drama had subsided, Aisha attended a community meeting at the local recreation center. The room was filled with people eager to share their stories, voices raised in both frustration and hope. An elderly woman approached Aisha, her eyes moist with emotion, and said softly, "Thank you for what you did today. Your courage means the world to us." Aisha's heart swelled with a mix of gratitude and determination. "This is just the beginning," she replied gently. "We have so much more work to do to ensure that every voice is heard and every injustice is righted." In the following weeks, the ripple effects of that fateful day became evident. Community leaders, law enforcement officials, and activists came together to discuss reforms and develop strategies aimed at ensuring transparency and accountability in policing. Aisha, who had once been a silent victim of injustice, now found herself at the forefront of a movement that demanded change. Her case was no longer just a personal battle, it had evolved into a clarion call for a fairer, more just society. As the movement gained momentum, Aisha continued to balance her legal work with public engagement. She attended additional town hall meetings, spoke at local colleges, and even participated in peaceful rallies organized by community activists. Each interaction, each conversation reinforced her belief that true justice was attainable only through collective effort. The story of that one quiet afternoon in the park had become a symbol of resilience, of the courage to stand up against abuse, and of the belief that every individual deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. And so, as the sun set on yet another day in Clearview, Aisha Thompson stood on the steps of the courthouse, watching a group of young activists gather for a peaceful demonstration. In that moment, she felt a renewed sense of hope. The system was far from perfect, and change was slow and often met with resistance, but with enough voices united in the pursuit of justice, progress was not only possible, it was inevitable. As we close this chapter of Aisha's journey, remember that her fight for justice is not an isolated story. It's a mirror reflecting the struggles and aspirations of countless individuals who have dared to stand against systemic abuse. The path ahead remains challenging, yet every step taken toward accountability and reform brings us closer to a fairer society. So, as Aisha Thompson's story unfolds and transforms from a moment of personal injustice to a broader fight for change, we must ask ourselves, in a world where power can so easily corrupt, are we ready to stand up and demand the justice we all deserve?